So moved.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? We can do this by the button. Let's see.
Okay, 7-0.
Thank you very much. Now, council, we will go into the arena project presentation to be presented by Doug Smith. Mr. Spore, do you want to say anything before Doug comes on?
No, sir, I'm fine.
Okay. Doug, we welcome your presentation.
Thank you, Mayor. Mayor Sessions, Vice Mayor Judge, members of council, certainly a pleasure to be with you to make a presentation that candidly is 2 years in the making. And really a pleasure to be in front of you and share some information. And obviously, we've gotten to a point with folks from USM where we think we know we have a deal for council to consider. And so tonight, I'm going to visit.
Excuse me, Doug. I promised something and I didn't do it. Andrea, you wanted to come up and just say hello for 2 minutes? Please?
Thank you.
Sure.
I probably won't even take the 2 minutes.
Okay. And I'm sorry, council.
Thank you. I sincerely appreciate that. Thank you, Mayor Sessions, and for allowing me to take the few minutes to address council today. First of all, I just want to thank all the city staff that have worked on this project for the last 2 years. And I'll tell you, the last couple of weeks, both Doug Smith and Mark Stiles have been tireless in their efforts to work out the details of this agreement, so I thank them. Today is an important milestone as we bring forward a transaction that creates a new national model for public-private investment and cooperation. We have worked diligently together to address issues that have been raised by all the stakeholders, and specifically the citizens of Virginia Beach, including traffic, parking, event coordination with the convention center and the oceanfront. This arena will be a game changer for Virginia Beach and for the region. Along with our local team members, SB Ballard and Clark Nixon, we will have hands-on involvement in the construction and in the day-to-day operations of this arena with our international team members. As residents of the city, we are proud of the economic impact that this will bring to the city, including the jobs during construction and after. It will serve as a venue for major entertainment and professional sports that currently bypass our region, and memories of a lifetime for all that reside here and visit here. Please, if you have any questions today or afterwards, we are here to answer any of your questions. And although it is an aggressive schedule, we are gearing up for a 2018 grand opening. And I thank all of you for your input during this process and ask for your support and your vote on December 8th. Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Appreciate it. Doug, I'm sorry for the interruption. I apologize.
Little mic problem back there, so
Okay.
apparently y'all couldn't hear me. Again, I'm thrilled to be here with you. I'm going to talk you through, and let's see. Just gonna. Who's got those slides? Thank you. What I'm going to do is walk you through really a summary of the arena plans, and some of this is going to be a repeat of information that folks saw last year, but I think it's important to get everybody grounded back again in what the project is, where it's going, and what some of the basic principles are. We'll talk you through USM's plan of finance, how they're going to finance their requirements. I'll talk you through our plan of finance and how we're going to meet our obligations. And then really the new information will be about the final deal and the deal documents, and give you a little bit of an overview of those deal documents. But part of what you all know and the public should know is that as soon as I'm finished, we're going to post all of the deal documents and summaries of each of those documents online. So folks will have an opportunity to see that information, and we'll talk a little bit more about the opportunities to clarify that information, but also the chance for public hearing. Talk a little bit about timing. This timing has changed a little bit from the last time we were together in terms of some of the opening, but you heard Andrea talk about their interest in getting the venue open by 2018. And then we'll talk about the path forward in terms of some of the things we'll do relative to the public. So just to remind everybody of what we're talking about, we're obviously talking about an arena adjacent to the Virginia Beach Convention Center. It's order of magnitude of $200 million project, 500,000 square feet. I think the piece that is most relevant for folks is the capacity, depending on whether you're going to a concert or a sporting event. It's a venue that has a capacity of 16,500 and can expand to 18,000 attendees. The ownership structure, you'll hear me talk a couple of times about leases and properties and different things. The core sort of ownership structure revolves around what is now 5.8 acres adjacent to the convention center, part of a 40-acre project site that we would actually lease to USM. One of the changes that you'll hear about tonight is the lease term. When the last time we were talking about the term sheet was a 40-year term, it's now a 60-year term. And just to talk about that real quickly, that really is driven by the private financing. And as a practical matter, in talking to their lender, USM has learned that their initial loan term, in all likelihood, be a 15 or 20-year term. Any lender, but the lender they're talking to is going to want to have confidence that they can refinance and that they can refinance for another 30-year term. So obviously, if you've got that kind of initial term, a 40-year term wouldn't accommodate that. So we've extended the term to 60 years. I'll talk a little bit about, because of that, we're going to need to involve the Virginia Beach Development Authority, and I'll talk a little bit about what that looks like and how we're going to do that. I'm going to talk in the next slide about the team, which we think is really an interesting mix of local and national talent, but the operator is one of the giants in the industry in terms of managing these venues. SMG is on the USM team, and they manage 70 arenas and theaters around the country, and also a great many convention centers. Premium seating is really an important component of arenas today, and so you'll see the 30 suites. And the suites, 10 or 15 years ago was all about those boxes we used to talk about, but now it's a lot more about the club level and loge seats and premium seating, and so there'll be 500 club seats and then 40 loge boxes. The team, I mentioned earlier, we think it's a nice combination of local and national talent, and you've almost got a local and a national partner throughout the process. You can see the design team, the design build team, ESG, or local ESG, Andrea and her team head up that group along with CMEC, which is an international design and engineering procurement firm. But you've got AECOM, national firm that has designed a great many of these facilities, teamed with Clark Nexon and Chris Stone, who lives here at Virginia Beach and runs Clark Nexon. The joint venture for the design builds on the construction side. Obviously, Steve Ballard and SB Ballard, a local Virginia Beach company, teamed with Mortensen out of Minnesota, who's built, Mortensen's built a number of these. Steve's firm actually built the TED here in Hampton Roads. So a nice mix of local and national expertise and talent, and a list that you've certainly seen before. In terms of the plan of finance for the arena, the basics really haven't changed. The developer is going to be responsible for providing the financing for the arena. It will be private ownership. This private ownership is a pretty unique model, and I've gotten a number of calls in the last 9 months talking about it's been awfully quiet on the arena side, and I would tell you that in large part it's been that effort to strike that balance of public need for stewardship of tax dollars and control, balanced with the private sector wanting to be allowed to do the things that the private sector does well, and for the public sector to not be deeply engaged in their day-to-day operations. And so bridging that gap of both very relevant goals has been a challenge. The financing consists of $170 million of debt that they will get from a foreign lender, and then $40 million of equity that the USM team will bring, and that includes $10 million of working capital. Our obligations include making what we're calling incentive payments. And this is that idea you've heard me talk about a lot about. We've talked about a lot publicly of the but-for taxes. What are those revenues that are generated in the building that would not exist but for this project. Additionally, we will incorporate or include 1% of the hotel tax, and so that is money that goes into the tip fund that today represents about $3.2 million. Those payments, and I'll talk in some more detail, those payments are made into what's called an arena fund, and the General Assembly, gave us enabling legislation that set up, our ability to, in effect, rebate these taxes to the project, and we don't make anything simple. So it is, there's a pretty complex process of how that money flows to the state and how it flows back to us and how it flows back to USM, and I'll touch on that in just a moment. We fully expect USM to pledge those revenues to their lender. We expect them to pledge the other revenues that are generated in this project. And one of the things you'll hear me say a lot, this is a private arena. And one of the things we have to get away from is thinking of this as a public arena, because it's not. And so there's a risk and reward component of that, in that we, in a private arena, we have shifted risk to the private sector, the money that they are borrowing, the construction risk that they are taking, the operating risk that they are taking, but also we've shifted some of the rewards. So the sponsorship money and those sorts of revenues that come from that building, and in our case, the but-for taxes, are going to go back to USM to pay for their debt service. Now, again, it's a 60-year term, but this is important. And I think part of what makes this deal attractive to folks is this idea that if there are any shortfalls, that USM would be responsible for any revenue shortfalls. So if anything happens, the city is not responsible for any venue shortfalls, or if the taxes don't meet the projections that we all think they will meet, that is for USM to deal with. And then at the end of the term, at the end of the 60-year term, the building actually reverts to the city. In terms of our plan for financing our infrastructure, you all have heard me talk a couple of different times about on-site improvements and off-site improvements, and I'll spend a little bit of time right now talking about those. But the simplest explanation is we are responsible for the public infrastructure, just as you'd expect. The water and sewer and conveyance of stormwater and roads and sidewalks and all those things that the city normally puts in place, we're going to put in place for this project. The reality is there is a lot of efficiency, and we think economies of scale and other benefits from having USM actually be in control of the implementation and the development, the design and construction of what we're calling the on-site arena infrastructure. I'll show you a slide in just a second. And that's the stuff that's really around the arena, so that when you're staging for construction and when you're making sure that the infrastructure is finished and the arena is finished and they all finish in time to have a seamless opening, that happens, and USM will be in control of that. There are some off-site improvements, and those are some turn lanes, some improvements up near the interstate, or not near, but at the interstate in Bird Neck, and some things further away from the arena that just logically aren't part of the core arena project, and so we still need to get those done, but those will be a more traditional design bid process that we'll put forward. And so in round numbers, there's about $45 million of that on-site infrastructure that USM will be responsible for, about $21 million or so of what I'm describing as off-site infrastructure, and another $10 or $11 million of improvements to 19th Street. You'll remember what we put in into this year's CIP. So those are three projects that were appropriated by council in this last budget. And you can see that last bullet. There's two things there. The total cost of those infrastructure improvements is about $76.5 million. That money will be derived through the sale of public facility revenue bonds. Those bonds will be paid back by the TIP fund. So again, this idea of it's not general fund money, but TIP fund money that will actually pay the debt on those capital improvements. And again, you'll see that last thing there to just give you a sense of what we're talking about. But it's parking and stormwater and undergrounding utilities and sidewalks and those sorts of things. It's probably, I think, helpful for folks that don't live and breathe this stuff every day to just do a quick review of the TIP fund, the Tourism Improvement Fund, or Tourism Investment Program. Is really some of the cigarette tax, 10% of the 10% amusement tax, a piece of the participatory sports tax, some of the hotel tax, and some smaller taxes that go into that fund to finance projects that are obviously tourism related, in our case really for the ocean front. The biggest expenditure coming out of the TIP fund right now is roughly $24 million a year that's continuing to pay the debt on the Virginia Beach Convention Center. That debt goes away, so that'll be paid off in a few years. But in the meantime, the TIP fund is tight, and so we've got some, we don't have a lot of capacity to take on projects. So one of the things, we've had a lot of conversation with the hoteliers, and in order to bridge that gap where things are tight and we need to get this infrastructure in place, we advocated for a dollar a night room tax, if you will, or service charge that the hoteliers supported. And we'd actually intended for that, and you all passed an ordinance that said that would start in January of 16, so this coming January. As the project has delayed, as things have worked through, and it really looks like it would be the start of a project in a year later or more, then we're looking at that dollar charge starting in January of 17. But again, a lot of support from the hotel community.
And what's that generate?
That generates about about $2 million, so about 2 million room nights a year. In terms of our expenses and how we're paying for, not how we're paying, but what we're paying, again, we're talking about 30 years of incentives to USM. Again, it's those but-for taxes that we talked about. There's about $3.2 million from the 1% hotel tax. The other local taxes add up to about $4.5 million, exclusive of the real estate tax and the B poll, which is another $1.7 million. When you look at when we calculate net fiscal impact, it's maybe as much art as it is science in trying to understand sort of what a project is going to bring to us or what it's going to cost us to support. And you all met Bill Rhoda a while back with CSL, who's a consultant that was helping us in the early days of this project, and we got him to do a net fiscal impact. And he estimated that the direct and indirect benefits from this project, and this is where the art comes in, net of, we will call it substitution or displacement, but money that somebody might be paying otherwise, that they bought an arena ticket tonight and they're spending money at the arena tonight, but if the arena weren't there, they might be going to a restaurant in town center, or they might be going to a movie somewhere. So it's not necessarily, you got to figure out what's new money. So the net of all that is about $6.5 million. Those payments in that initial year to USM, we estimated about $9.4 million. And we think there'll be city services or expenses for us for about $500,000, which ends up showing a annual fiscal impact of about $3.2 million, which is roughly the amount of the 1% hotel tax. So again, all that money derived from the TIP fund. So again, I think this has been a critically important part of the conversation, is that the general fund is not expected to have any significant, or really any impact from this project. Again, all those city taxes I talked about would come out of the TIP fund. So that's all, for the most part, stuff that folks have heard before, a couple of changes. And so the next 6 or 8 slides will really talk about the deal and what's evolved since we were last year talking about the term sheet. And if you only want to, if somebody at home only wants to understand the very basics of the deal, these next 2 slides will do that for you. And this is the idea, again, that this is a private arena. It is privately owned, privately financed, privately constructed, privately operated, and obviously in the city of Virginia Beach. The city is providing the land, the infrastructure, revenue streams that will support the debt service. I talked earlier about that 60-year term. The lease will actually flow through the Virginia Beach Development Authority. So one of the things that I'll talk about in a minute on y'all's resolution will actually approve conveying the property to the Development Authority. It'll be a pretty quick transaction where the Development Authority will get the property. They will actually execute the lease, and they will send that property subject to that lease back to the city. So council will stay in control of this project throughout the process. We're talking about, this is a slight change. We talked in the term sheet about a 5-acre property. It's really we think it's closer to 5.8 acres, in part to get them road frontage. You really can't have a parcel of land that doesn't have road frontage, or you got to get into subdivision variances and different things, and it was just easier to give enough access to 17th Street to get that 5.8 acres. And then one of the important pieces that I think we've said all along is we fully expect the city land, that 5.8 acres, will be subordinate to the USM's private loan. So that's an important piece to know. Again, the but-for taxes, the 1% hotel tax will go into the arena fund and then be dispersed to USM. Initially, that'll be monthly, but over time, that'll happen quarterly. And we're talking about the $76.5 million worth of our infrastructure being paid for out of the TIP fund. In terms of USM's obligations, their obligations are to finance, construct, and operate this arena, and to build it in accordance with the plans that we've all seen and agreed to. This is an important couple of slides. It's also their responsibility to maintain and operate the arena to minimum standards of quality and number of events or number of attendees. So what does that mean? So we've looked at their pro forma, and USM and the city have agreed that roughly two-thirds a performance of about two-thirds of that pro forma is a minimum standard that we would accept, or we would find acceptable. And that equates to 20 shows of 7,500 people or more and 450,000 people a year. And and you'll hear me talk about this a little bit later, but what happens if they don't hit those standards. And then the other is a little more subjective, but it's one of the things it's sort of, I know it when I see it. And so Bill Rhoda has helped us identify 3 arenas that we and USM and their team think are comparable, and then the kinds of arenas that set the standard for maintenance and fit and finish that are appropriate for our venue. So they'll have to maintain them up to those industry standards. And I should have said those are in Lincoln, Nebraska, and Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Jacksonville, Florida. This is the part that I think for those that want to do a deep dive on this deal, this is going to be their opportunity to do that. The deal documents, there's 7 main documents that I'm going to talk about. The development agreement really manages our relationship through construction, so up until the venue opens up. And there's a lot that goes on, obviously, during that, and a lot of rights and responsibilities that we both have. The cost participation agreement, that is the document that governs the implementation of that on-site infrastructure that I was talking about, the USM, that roughly $45 million worth of infrastructure that USM will be designing and constructing on our behalf. The lease, this is the meat of the deal. This is the 60-year agreement that really memorializes our relationship. And I talked about the arena fund agreement, and it's fairly complex in terms of how that money flows and what we see and how we validate that money and how that money flows back. It's in some ways it's simple in that they generate it, they get it back, but there's a lot of mechanics that have to go into that. The cooperation agreement, the reality is we've got a convention center across the street from an arena, and we want both of those places to be very busy. And so parking and traffic management and event prioritization and those sorts of things are going to be an ongoing challenge that we've all got to work through, and we put the framework of how that can happen or should happen in the form of this cooperation agreement. And then the loan cure rights agreement really manages the relationships among the USM, the city, and their lender. And I'll talk about each of these in a little bit of detail, including the council resolution. But again, on the website, it's actually under the economic development tab for the arena project, and there's already a lot of information out there for us. These documents and the deal summary. So if somebody says, I don't want to read the whole lease, there's a 3 or 4 page summary of each of these documents out there that'll give you a pretty good sense of what we're doing. And I'm not expecting anybody to comprehend what's on there, but I'm going to show you sort of each of these agreements, but just to give you a sense of the complexity. Here's the development agreement, and it sets out the project area and what we're building and what the basic program is going to be. It talks about timing of loan commitment and loan construction and those sorts of things. It talks about remedies in the event that one of us does not meet the obligations that we have. It talks about, and this has been really important, and USM and their team, in particular Steve Ballard, are very sensitive to SWAM requirements, and so we've made that's all documented in the development agreement. And there are a couple of key items, and they're key in that they're either slightly different from the term sheet or perhaps new, not at all intended to be maybe the most important item or comprehensive overview at all. But we have, and this is where we talk about that relationship of the public relative to a private building. And in some ways, you can think of this as a private office building, and in some ways, it's not any different. But and yet, we're dedicating a great many taxes, and we're dedicating a great deal of infrastructure. And so we want to know that the deal that USM and their lender has certain things in it. And so we've got some private loan approval rights, and they are confined to the 4 things that are up on that list, which is basically saying we know it's going to be fully funded. We know that the protections that we want in terms of cure rights are reflected in their documents and the ones that we've agreed to. We want to make sure that there's no terms in there that we know would result in the credit agency counting our obligations to them as our debt, as our direct debt. And finally, that the loan is generally consistent with the terms that we've talked about in terms of the $170 million of debt and $40 million of equity and those sorts of things. Timing is a little bit different than what we talked about in December, in that once you all, USM, in talking to their lender, really needs to know the deal. It needs to know what's in these documents and what the city is willing to commit to and what USM is willing to commit to before they can move forward to a loan commitment. And so we spent a lot of time talking about how long does that take and what are the protections that everybody has there. And where that has landed is once you all, should you move forward and adopt the resolution supporting this, and I'll explain what's going to be in that resolution, then USM has 8 to 10 months. And it's really 8 months, but if we feel like they're close, we have the ability, and obviously we would all be encouraged to extend it 2 more months, so 8 to 10 months to get a loan commitment, and then from whenever they get that commitment, another 8 to 10 months to close on that loan, and then they have another 10 to 12 months to start construction. With all that said, they have an outside opening date of October of 2019. And you heard Andrea say it's their every intention to get this thing open in 2018. And part of why they want these terms, these milestones, to not be too brief is because our remedies, are to walk away from the deal. So you need to be really careful that you give everybody adequate time to do the things that they need to do. The lease, again, don't expect you to look at all these things, but just to give you a sense of what is in this document. And this talks about, what we're leasing. It talks about the public plaza. The public plaza is an important part of the project that we've talked a lot about during the term sheet phase. Talks about, obviously, the term of the deal, what happens if somebody doesn't meet their obligations during the lease, those sorts of things. Talks about the fee subordination. A couple of key things in the lease. Parking is critically important to all the projects of the oceanfront. It's critically important to the arena. And obviously, if you're going to go to a show, it needs to be clear that we've got a place to park. One of the beauties of this product at the oceanfront is the season for the arena is really our off-season at the oceanfront. So at a point in time where we have an abundance of parking is when they are going to need parking. And so you're looking at shows really in the September to March, April kind of time frame. With that said, one of the things that we've said is that parking for an arena goer, an arena patron, will be free from the 1st of October until the middle of May. So again, basically our off season. So if you got an arena ticket and you go, and then part of it is we want to encourage people, frankly, to get down here and get parked in our facilities and go to our restaurants and other facilities. We've got a requirement, so we talked a lot about that cooperation agreement with the convention center, and one of the things we have committed to is that at bigger events, the reality is most of their events are going to be parked completely on site, or there will be adequate parking to be completely parked on site. Events that are over 6,500, which we think there'll be, is 20 or more a year, then you start getting outside of that 40-acre footprint. And we have a commitment that we will, at any given event, we will identify 2,700 spaces for that event. So whatever the number is on site, net of some activity at the convention center, and then we'll identify spaces specifically in one of our garages or one of our lots at the ocean front. Now one of the reasons that we've talked, and Mr. Woods talked about this a lot, we've talked a lot about redevelopment. And the reality is part of why we want to do this project is to attract other investment into the resort and into the Central Beach District. And we hope we do it right, very close by. Well, the reality is if we develop on that 40 acres, we're taking parking away. And so one of our requirements is if we do redevelop something there, we have to replace that parking in that 40 acres one for one. Likewise, if we change the parking supply at the oceanfront, and I can't imagine where we would decrease the parking supply, Mr. Earn, you may have, I suspect, the same opinion. But as long as we keep that current supply where it is or higher, we're fine. But if we were to drop below that current supply, then we have to increase that supply for parking outside the 40 acres. Additionally, in terms of redevelopment, USM does have rights in terms of some of the uses that we've restricted, and there are things that, there's things that neither of us wants next to an arena or next to the convention center as part of a redevelopment plan. And so we've got some restrictions there, and they've got some rights over. We really, as a practical matter, we cannot redevelop that parking plaza, certainly not without that public plaza, not without their permission. And finally, on the lease term, for 40 years, if the city were to offer financial support to a competing venue, and a competing venue we've defined as a live entertainment venue, indoor entertainment venue with more than 4,000 seats within 5 miles of the arena, then we would forego our ability to apply those minimum operating standards that I talked about earlier. So obviously, if we've supported a competitor coming in, we've impacted their pro forma. But again, 5 miles would be the limit there. So some key lease terms is just understanding sort of our rights if there are breaches relative to any of these agreements. As a practical matter, the minimum operating standards are really going to be the thing that we're going to pay the most attention to, because we want to make sure that the reasons we did this was to bring people down, stay in place, and that the quality of the venue stays in place. Beyond that, once the facility is open, if there's something that's happening that we think is a breach of the agreement or not consistent with what we're doing, our remedies are, frankly, to go to court and have a judge agree or disagree with us. If we want to look at those minimum operating standards and they don't meet those standards for 2 years running, then our right, not our obligation, but our right is to step in and buy the venue for the appraised value, obviously with less any outstanding loan balance and any fees that are owed on that loan. The one thing I think we all need to be aware of is the arena fund payments, our payments into that fund continue but for an adjudicated default. But as a practical matter, if USM defaults on their loan, it's the bank that's going to be dealing with them. And the bank can step in and bring a new operator in. The bank can proceed to foreclosure. Our options at that point are to acquire the property. If the bank doesn't do that, and we choose to, we can go in and acquire the property for fair market value. If that happens during construction, so this is a partially built facility, then we can do that again for the fair market value without any penalties, prepayment penalties, or any kind of fees from the bank. If that happens after it's open, then if there are lender fees or charges above the balance, then we would be responsible for them if we wanted to do that. We could simply allow the arena to go to foreclosure and deal with it at that point. Cost participation agreement, I've touched on. Again, this is everything in orange is the on-site infrastructure improvements that I talked about. Everything in maroon is the off-site. And I've been working on this for I don't know how many months, and it wasn't until last week that I realized it was clearly a Virginia Tech engineer that did the orange and maroon buttons here. I've never seen maroon buttons on a engineering plan before. But again, it's our responsibility to provide those on-site improvements and those off-site improvements, and USM will put those in place. They'll all be city-owned, city-maintained, except for the venue signs, the marquee signs that USM will be responsible to operate, maintain, and insure. Again, in terms of the arena infrastructure and the cost participation agreements, they'll develop those on-site improvements on our behalf, and we'll hire someone to handle the off-site improvements. The on-site improvements, we have a cap of about $45 million, not a commitment, but a capped not to exceed number of just over $45 million. And again, they've agreed to follow the state SWAM certified small business guidelines. Arena fund agreement I've talked about in pretty good detail. Obviously, we have enabling legislation that allows us to put these revenues into that agreement. We'll do that for 30 years. You can see the list of those but-for taxes, the real estate taxes, the B-poll, admissions, and the state and local sales and meals tax, and then a piece of the state sales tax. We talked about the cooperation agreement, but again, it deals with things like parking, traffic control, security, booking, scheduling of events. So there's going to be a lot of communication between these two venues. And then the loan cure rights agreement is really the framework for the relationship among the city as the landlord, USM as the tenant, and the bank as their lender. The loan terms are not finalized, and so that agreement at this point is a framework, and that will be filled in once the lender brings their commitment to the table. In terms of your resolution, last couple of slides here, what you all would consider if you move forward is a resolution that the city manager could execute the development agreement, and that's really the trigger that allows USM to move to conversations with their lender. It would also allow the city manager to execute the other agreements as long as they stay in the same condition that you all approved. You'll remember that the arena fund legislation requires us to send all the agreements to the General Assembly and to the state treasurer for review. And then once all the conditions of the loan have been satisfied or loan closing have been satisfied, we would move to execute those documents. And then finally, we would transfer the resolution that would allow the city manager to transfer the 5.8 acres over to the Development Authority, who would execute that lease and convey it back. Wrapping up, in terms of where we go from here over the next 30 or 40 days, obviously we've got this briefing, and again, those documents that I've talked about will be publicized in a few minutes, and anybody will get access to those. We'll do a briefing for the Development Authority on the 17th to just make sure they're clear on the role that they will play in this process. We will have a briefing at 6 o'clock on the 19th at the Virginia Beach Convention Center, which is going into probably more detail than I'm going into, and I think that's Andrea and I really together answering questions and making sure folks are clear on what the deal is. But the deal will be the deal at that point, and so folks can like the deal, they can not like the deal. We want them to understand the deal, but as a practical matter, it won't change dramatically unless we go back and revisit items at your request. And that brings us to a public hearing on the 1st of December back here, so, where folks will have had a chance to review these documents and clarify things, and could have a vote by council as soon as the 8th of December, and then the authority would vote to authorize their role on the 15th.
Very good.
Thank you, Mayor.
Questions or comments at this point? I would just say, Andrea came up here and thanks you all, but I want to speak on behalf of the council. I want to thank Doug and all the city staff and Jim Spore and all the city staff that have been working diligently here. I want to thank USM for their hard work. I want to thank the council. We've had 3 meetings in 3 days on this, but that's what we should be doing. And so I thank the council. And now I'm going to challenge the public. I mean, we've got this presentation that has just been made. I want the public to review this. I think you just at the end acknowledged that, to the public, look at this. If you like it, we want to hear it. If you don't like it, we need to hear that too. But, there's probably not going to be any changes because this is a private company that's made an offer, and we've come together with what we think would work. But it's time now for the public to say, move forward or don't move forward. And that would remind me again of the calendar that you just put up. We've got just under 30 days, which is a good amount of time, and we've got some good meetings planned under the leadership of Jim and Bobby to get this information out. And we will basically have two public hearings, one on the 1st and then the day of the vote as well.
Correct.
And, but anyway, compliments to everyone involved. I know everyone is worn out. This has been going on a long time, but now we're going to get to the point where our decision will be made in less than 30 days. So thanks. Barbara?
You asked for discussion, but you didn't take a breath.
Not me. Not me.
Well, I just feel I feel very strongly about this deal, and I don't want any misconceptions because I think the way it's been presented at this point, even though the mayor said very firmly in the interviews that were broadcast that this is not a done deal, I think it sounded like it might have been, and it sounded like we maybe all have agreed to these recommendations. I think back to a year ago when we were asked to approve a term sheet so that the developer could go to a lender and bring back a loan deal. And I supported that term sheet so that it could be unanimous, even though I had some very definite reservations, particularly about parking and the working with the convention center. And, you know, we were kind of assured that those things would be taken care of in the time that would be passed before we got the lease agreement back. But that was a very salient point of the important deal points, and I've read this in the closed session, and I'm sure the council doesn't want to hear it again, but just so the public knows what my big hang-up is we have been assured, and this I'm reading from the public briefing that was made November 20th, the media briefing, and this is also restated in the council briefing. Prior to council approval of final documents, all key financing terms to be agreed on by developer and lender and city to be provided with satisfactory evidence that such funds are committed, subject only to final approval by lender. And that was a strong commitment to us, that we wouldn't be asked to approve these final documents without all these financing agreements, terms with the lender for us to see and approval. And of course, at that time, it was anticipated that the loan would be received and we would be approving those documents by spring. Of course, that hasn't happened. But in the interim little briefings we've had up until a few weeks ago, the commitment was continued to be repeated to us that we wouldn't be asked to approve a lease unless all of this was available. We don't have that. And I'm just really concerned. The loan cure agreement specifically says, you know, there are blanks here because we have not had any identification with the lender. That third component, that third partner is not a part of this yet. And I'm really having a lot of struggle with that as one of the main changes that were in the deal points at first that has been changed. Of course, the whole timeline has been changed. I'm really concerned about 40 years going to 60 years and this sleight of hand that we're having to do to be able to get around that law. Other things that concern me, but I also am still not feeling real comfortable about the parking and those things that I was concerned about before because they've been relegated to, well, this is going to be a continuous challenge now for the next 60 years. So I just want everybody to know I will have a little crack to have a little bit of an open mind, but right now I've got this as a major concern that someone has to make me very comfortable with this in order for me to support this, and I just want this to be plain and what my concerns are. And but I also, I guess, you know, in good faith, because we thought we were going to be closing this deal during this year and it was going to need to be under construction during this budget year, we approved these two CIP projects and appropriated the money. My question regarding those approved CIP projects, Are they just on hold until we do have all of these things? Or are we going to begin the construction as the construction schedule is in the CIP and go forward anyway? What's going to happen?
There's actually three, just so you've got the on-site and off-site and then 19th Street. And we're not moving forward with construction until this deal, obviously, is not only voted upon, but finalized.
And so, but the money is encumbered?
Yes, ma'am.
As if it were?
Yes, ma'am.
So the funds that were appropriated are encumbered, even if it goes beyond the anticipated time today, it's encumbered.
Yes, ma'am.
We're not able to use it for any other
It's certainly not
use.
staff's intent to do anything with those funds without your direction.
Well, I just,
That's
just wanted to ask, and so we were clear on that. It's not available for use in the interim, is what you're saying. Well, I just wanted to be on record stating my concerns.
Bobby?
And thank you, and I appreciate Ms. Henley's, concerns going forward, but I guess as everybody at this dais knows that over the years, I have not been necessarily the 100% champion of public-private and partnerships, but let me tell you that I am jazzed on this one. I think as we go forward, looking positively at what this is going to do for the city, what this is going to do for the region, I think one of the things we found out, and I think Ms. Henley pointed out that, this was a far more complex type of deal, going forward, a lot of moving parts, with time that was taken, it took a long time to do things, certain changes are there. But I think if we look forward to what we're trying to do, what we're trying to accomplish here, the tangible benefits of this project are not necessarily the arena per se. It's going to be the amount of development. It's going to be the message that we're going to be sending that Virginia Beach is open to this type of business, that to encourage, hopefully that this now becomes a template in the future where other companies will come in and maybe give us a convention hotel without the amount of public participation we talked about in the past, maybe to stimulate the dome site, to stimulate the vibe area, and, and to give a true venue for all the people in Centerville and Kempsville and Bayside, a place to come and enjoy their own city. The benefit of our ultimate goal of trying to turn this into a year-round destination. This is a pinnacle of what we're trying to do. Imagine going forward a couple of years and seeing an ACC tournament, with the Goodyear blimp circling, just showing our arena and Virginia Beach to people, what that would do for marketing. So granted, we had to go through some humps and some barriers that had to be overcome. It was probably a very emotional process. But I think, the one thing Mr. Wood and I found that as we did engage with civic engagement, this was a project where the public was brought to the table early. Both parties got to present, and the public gave us a direction, which direction to go. And this deal is a complex deal. There's no question about it. But the point is, though, I think what we're going to see in the end result is going to be extremely positive, to the point where even a skeptic like myself I can't tell you how excited I am for this and what it can bring to the future of Virginia Beach. And I thank everybody for their efforts. This is going to be an ongoing process, and it's going to be a winner.
John Moss.
I think now the listening phase has started, so I really don't want to express all my thoughts. There'll be time for that. But I did want to make sure the public really did go to vb.gov and take the time to read the summaries. I can't highly recommend they read the detailed documents, though I have a couple times. But I do believe the summaries are well done. And if you really want to understand the risk that you're signing up for, because this is a yes or no proposition, I think the mayor characterized that correctly, that's the place where you go to be an informed provider. Look at those summaries and see if those are terms that you can accept. And if they're not, come out and tell us that. And if there are, come out and tell us that well. But in life, there's not perfection. But this is a deal I've been predisposed to support. I haven't heard anything yet that tells me that I shouldn't, but I'm here to listen to what the public thinks. But do go to the website, do read the summaries, do come out to the public hearing, do call us, do let us know what you think, because we really, I think sincerely, do care. And I want to make a point, again, no money from the unrestricted general fund is going into this project. So unless you spend a night in a hotel of your own choice, or unless you go to the actual arena yourself, You're not being asked to pay for the public infrastructure, and you're not being asked to pay for the arena. How many deals have we seen like that in Virginia Beach? Not one lately. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Other questions or comments? I'll go ahead and conclude. I would ask that you and USM set up a meeting with me and Mrs. Henley to go through this. Please, thank you very much. All right, we're going to move on to offshore drilling. Council, as you recall, we have had presentations on offshore drilling, pro and con, and they continue tonight.
I don't think we've had the pro one yet.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, members of council. I'm Clay Burnick from your planning department.
Clay, we all know you, and we're so glad to have you here.
Thank you, sir. As you know, just kind of a quick trip down memory lane, about 5.5 years ago, council adopted a resolution concerning offshore drilling, and particularly it voiced 3 things in that resolution: support for exploration, that royalty payments be split between the states on the Atlantic coast, and that whatever is done not impact operations or longevity with our relationship with the Navy. Back in August, Bob Mathias did give you a fairly extensive briefing looking at wind, oil, offshore gas, energy update, big picture, and then there was some additional information that was provided to you in the council package right after that concerning more detailed information. So today, what we'd like to try to do is continue that communication and effort to provide you full information. And to do that, we wanted to bring you a briefing that would explore some of the issues relating to offshore oil and natural gas development or exploration, and some of the other side of the issue, people that have some concerns and are opposed to that. There are many important issues in this to many in our local community. And before you, there are 2 items, I believe. One is a packet of information that has a map in it that first of all shows localities.
No, we don't have any map.
It shows localities in the southeast
Yes, we
who
do
have
have a
gone on record voicing their concerns about offshore drilling and exploration. And then there's also, in that package, local letters and resolutions that have been taken in our community or in Virginia that we were able to assemble for you. Tonight, the briefing will be handled by a guest we have from the Southern Environmental Law Center, Deborah Murray, who's a senior attorney with them. She had joined the Southern Environmental Law Center back in 1988, is involved in work in a lot of environmental issues, including advocating protection of our wetlands and our coastal waterways. Southern Environmental Law Center primarily operates, as its name would imply, in the southeast, Alabama, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia. She is somewhat local with us. She attended UVA undergraduate and UVA law school. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Ms. Murray.
We welcome you tonight, or this afternoon, rather, excuse me.
Good afternoon, Mayor
afternoon.
Sessoms, Vice Mayor Jones, and Council. My name is Deborah Murray. As Clay mentioned, I very much appreciate the opportunity to speak with you this afternoon. And I wanted to first discuss some of the where we are in the process before then talking about some of the issues that are surrounding offshore drilling. And I have this PowerPoint that to present. In January of this past year, the federal government announced its proposal to open up to offshore drilling the areas here that you can see off the coast of Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia. And this is a major shift in federal policy. There has never been offshore oil production in the Atlantic. The determination of what is in the draft proposed plan that could be opened up to offshore drilling and what isn't is based on a number of statutory criteria, including environmental considerations, economic considerations, and the input of affected states. And I should also add that in this draft proposed plan, if an area is not included in this 5-year plan, then there can be no drilling. And the federal government comes out with a plan every 5 years to set forth proposals for opening up areas to offshore drilling for the next 5 years. It's no coincidence that the states off the West Coast and on the Atlantic north of Virginia are not in the plan. That reflects the views of elected officials in those states, including the governors, that they did not favor offshore drilling. By contrast, our governor and the governors of the Carolinas and Georgia all are in favor of offshore drilling, and that's reflected in the plan. In announcing the proposed plan, the Secretary of Interior explained why certain areas were going to be off limits, why certain areas would be protected from offshore drilling, and she said some areas are just too special to drill. And I think the same is true for our offshore, off the coast of Virginia, as well as the other states in the southeastern Atlantic. Here we have a timeline. As I mentioned, the draft proposed program that the federal government issued came out in January of this past year, and a revised draft plan is expected in early 2016. And then there would be public comment and eventually a proposed final program, and then a final 5-year plan would be announced likely in the end of 2017. But as I mentioned, while the proposed program is expected to come out in early 2016, now is really the time for communities that might be affected by offshore drilling to let the government know their views. Now is the time, while the federal government is still considering which areas are going to remain in the plan and potentially which areas might be taken out. I want to look at some of the purported benefits from offshore drilling. And you no doubt have heard the figure of 25,000 jobs that would be created in Virginia by 2035 as a result of offshore oil and gas development. That figure comes from a 2013 study prepared by Quest Offshore Resources that was funded by oil and gas associations. And note the timing. It came out in 2013, but the federal government proposal came out just in 2015. And the prediction of 25,000 jobs significantly overstates the amount of jobs and economic activity that would be created, because the report is based on incorrect assumptions, as well as some assumptions that are, at the very least, highly questionable. For example, the Quest report assumed that the entire Atlantic would be open to offshore drilling, and that all federal waters would be involved. Whereas the actual federal government proposal, as you saw, would allow offshore drilling only from Virginia down, and there would be a 50-mile buffer zone. So federal waters extend from 3 miles out. The Quest report assumed offshore drilling would take place from 3 miles out on, whereas the federal government is proposing a 50-mile buffer. Those discrepancies, those differences are significant because the Quest economic predictions of economic activity are expressly tied to an area that is much larger than the actual proposal, the actual agency proposal. And so because their economic activity is tied to the area, you can see that that is, through no fault of their own, that's a significant overestimate. Likewise, the amount of economic activity is based on Quest's assumption of future oil prices. The report does not reflect different pricing scenarios, however, and it was prepared at a time when oil prices were at its peak. The report does not consider that lower oil prices, as we are now experiencing, might in fact discourage investment. Of course, oil prices are very hard to predict in advance, but nonetheless, this assumes it does not take into consideration that oil prices might decide to discourage investment. The other variable here is that, of course, not all economic activity or all jobs are going to be translated into local, long-term jobs. Certainly, the labor force, the skilled labor in the Gulf of Mexico, the workers are highly mobile, and the federal government has indicated that certainly in the foreseeable future, skilled oil workers as well as equipment would come from outside the region. The Quest report assumes that by 2035, the vast majority of jobs and equipment would come from within the region, but it doesn't disclose the basis for those assumptions. So it's certainly not clear that that would at all be the case. I would also say that there are so many different variables involved. I touched on some of them, that it's very difficult to predict what the economic activity would be for the region or for Virginia if offshore drilling were to occur. And yet, while the Quest report acknowledges to some extent the uncertainty, I think those who have repeated the figure of 25,000 jobs are doing a disservice, because giving such a precise number creates the mistaken false illusion of certainty, and that's certainly not the case. Revenue sharing is something else that you hear about. As you know, of course, right now the law does not allow revenue sharing other than on a limited basis with the Gulf of Mexico states. So in order for revenue sharing with the states to occur, Congress would have to change the law. I know, of course, that there are some of our elected officials are supportive of that, but I would suggest that with tighter federal budgets and some impetus to reduce deficit spending, that is highly unlikely. In some years, oil and gas revenues to the federal government from royalties, et cetera, are second only to the income that they receive from federal income tax, amounting to some almost $7 billion. So whether or not that would ever occur is unlikely, I would say. The other lower gas prices, I won't spend much time on that, but we all know that oil and gas are traded on a global market, and so we in the U.S. and certainly here have just a fraction of the world's reserves, and therefore offshore oil and gas reserves off the Atlantic would have a very trivial, if any, impact on gas prices. But I think, one of the key points here is that the Quest report certainly does not purport to be a cost-benefit analysis. And so any economic gains that one might perceive from offshore drilling, of course, also have to be weighed against the significant threats or risks from offshore drilling on our current coastal economy, our way of life, and the natural environment. And certainly you all know better than I how much this community is dependent on the thriving tourism industry here. The Virginia Beach Convention and Visitors Bureau recently put out figures showing that in 2014, $1.4 billion were spent by visitors here in Virginia Beach, with accounting for over 12,500 jobs and $244 million in salaries. Their figures from last year showed coastal Virginia tourism as a whole at $4.4 billion. And of course, a major oil spill could be devastating to the tourism industry. And as you know, the Virginia Beach Restaurant and Hotel Associations, as well as the Virginia Beach Resort Advisory Commission, have formally taken a position against offshore drilling, in part because of these threats. Offshore drilling would also present risks to the fishing industry. And as you can see here, it's somewhat surprising. This is volume rather than revenue, but Virginia ranks 4th in the nation for the volume of fish landings. This was true in 2013, also true this year. The statistics came out recently. That's the highest on the East Coast. We also know that we have over a $50 million aquaculture industry that is dependent on clean water. Chesapeake Bay is known for its blue crabs. That's the most valuable fishery in the Chesapeake Bay. The stocks currently are depleted. Offshore drilling is particularly concerning for the blue crab fishery because the larval stages of the blue crab development takes place out on the continental shelf. And I should mention also that the Mid-Atlantic Fisheries Management Council, as well as the Southern Fishery Management Council, have all expressed concerns about offshore drilling. They have not formally opposed, but they have expressed serious concerns. Military operations. As you know, of course, when there was a proposed lease sale just off the Virginia coast back in 2010, before the BP spill, the Department of Defense evaluated the area that was proposed for offshore drilling to look to see the compatibility with its extensive military operations. And those colors are a little bit hard to see in this light, but the brownish orange, those are the areas that the military in its 2010 report said would be completely incompatible with its military operations. So that's an outline. You can see the 50-mile buffer of where for that Virginia proposed sale that the military said that 72% would be completely incompatible. The gray said that also there would be a certain amount that would be incompatible with maintaining permanent structures. So it was roughly about 3/4 all told that the military said. And the hatch mark shows where the area was proposed to be leased back in 2010. There is an additional element there that's only in the orangish brown that is the current. But as you can see, the current proposal of opening offshore Virginia encompasses the same area that the military evaluated back in 2010. And I know that we're waiting for another report from the Department of Defense, but really, I don't think anything has changed from their mapping area. The natural environment, of course. One of the statutory criteria that the Secretary of Interior must look at in considering what's in and what's out of the plan is the relative environmental sensitivity ranking of an area. And the Atlantic, according to the Department of Interior, ranks near the top of the scale in terms of environmental sensitivity. I'll just give you a couple of examples. Well, you can look at the beautiful, the first was, of course, Virginia Beach. This is the Chesapeake Bay of our glorious natural resources here. This is a picture of the organisms found in the Deepwater Canyon, the Norfolk Canyon. NOAA, in the last 2 years, I guess, about 2013, made some very dramatic discoveries about the biological richness of both the Norfolk Canyon as well as the Baltimore Canyon, which is off Maryland shores. And these canyons extend down to about 2,000 meters. But they're, just thriving diversity of deep water corals and octopus, and this is just on one particular ledge. As you know, the Virginia Aquarium is proposing that the Norfolk Canyon be considered as for Canada as a marine sanctuary. And ironically, of course, the Norfolk Canyon, if you can see that outline, that's the proposed area that would be opened up off Virginia's coast for offshore drilling. And the Norfolk Canyon there is there in purple. Other vulnerable habitat and species, North Atlantic right whale. This is a snapshot covering 5 years, and as the caption reads, because whales swim continuously, the sightings are obsolete within minutes, but this is a composite for that 5-year period. The North Atlantic right whale is highly endangered. There are fewer than 450 animals left, and their habitat is only off the Atlantic. They calve off the waters of the Carolinas and Georgia, and then they migrate up to Atlantic, New England area for breeding and feeding. So they definitely go past Virginia, but more recent studies have also shown that these animals are present off the Virginia coast year-round. And with these highly endangered species, the threat of ship strikes, getting hit by ships, is a significant concern, and certainly with any offshore development that could certainly present greater risks for these species. And Mr. Allman was quoted in the paper as saying that, the general concern, of course, with the oil is it only takes one mistake, and then it takes decades to get out from under that. And we certainly all learned from the unfortunate spill in the Gulf of Mexico back in 2010 that, unfortunately, there is no such thing as completely safe offshore drilling, nor is there any guarantee of effective and quick cleanup. The BP Horizon blowout spilled over 206 million gallons of oil lasting over a stretch of 87 days. And unfortunately, the effects from the BP spill 5 years later still persist. There's still oil beneath the surface of the waters, affecting dolphins and fish and other organisms. Tar balls still wash up on the shore. And in terms of economic activity, in 2014, the oyster harvest levels were still a third of what they were pre-spill. And it isn't just the risk of a major oil spill, major disaster such as happened in the Gulf, but there are minor spills as well as pollution from offshore drilling. This is a map showing from post BP spill, which happened in April of 2010, for a 5-year period showing other spill reports. In Louisiana, over 1,500 more minor spills are reported each year, with an average amount of oil of 330,000 gallons each year. And some have expressed concern that with offshore drilling, you also get industrialization of the coast that would change the nature of the way that we experience our beaches now. This was from a letter from the Virginia Beach Restaurant Association officially taking a position against offshore drilling. And that's a picture of some of the port infrastructure from Louisiana. And just to repeat, a number of organizations here in Virginia Beach, after carefully considering the risks, the potential risks from offshore drilling and weighing those against what's at stake, have taken a position against offshore drilling. And I understand from your packet that there is one more association that's been added since then, the Resort Beach Civic League, I believe. That's in your packet. That is the most recent association to take a position, apparently right at the end of October. And this doesn't show up very well in this light, but you do have this in your packet. Local governments opposed to South Atlantic drilling. In the Carolinas and Georgia, over 50 local governments have now expressed their opposition to offshore drilling. And I know that council, of course, took a position back in 2010, but that was before the BP oil spill, and I would just hope that council might consider re-looking at their position on offshore drilling. And I'm happy to take any.
We thank you very much for your
questions.
presentation. Any questions or comments, Mr. Moss?
Just two. I went back and on your salary, just so you might want to put a computation, that average salary in Virginia Beach for tourism comes out to $19,250 per job. And on coastal Virginia, it's $20,000. So my point is it may well generate benefit to someone out of the gross, but you notice the salaries were a small component of the total overall effect. And those people can't afford to live in Virginia Beach on $19,250. So I think that's important for people to realize. But what I'd like to see from both sides, because I don't think, I see lots of rhetoric, but I would like to see exactly the empirical analysis that you conducted, the data that you relied upon, the methodology that you used to assign the probability of risk, the severity of the risk, the consequence when the risk happens. I mean, this is true of the oil industry as well, but I think both sides talk to superlatives and make general characterizations, but I've yet to see comprehensive data set and really good methodology that confirms, because I would suspect, just guessing, that if you went back into the 50s and 40s when there was still drilling in the coast of the Gulf of Mexico, about that far, when there was no regulatory environment, how much of the increase is due to the rigorous of capturing reports? And though therefore it looks like the activity has grown, it could have declined. It's just reporting is more rigorous. I think we have to understand all of that. And rather than just both sides, I think, make generalizations. Generalization as to the benefit, generalization as to the risk. So I hope your organization has that type of material that you can share that substantiates the positions you've taken today. That's all. That's just all.
Oh, well, I should add, Mr. Moss, that we have provided a fact sheet that I think.
A fact sheet is not the underlying data set. It's not the underlying references. It doesn't explain the methodology by which those facts were deduced. It's just a fact, but an unvalidated fact.
I'd be happy to, once you've had a chance to read the fact sheet, if you would like to give me a call, I'd be happy to respond to anything
I need the data
specific.
set.
hopefully there is some data there.
Any other questions or comments? Yes, sir, Bobby.
Yeah, thank you. Just real quick, this is going to be a tough, decision and debate over the next couple of years. And I know this is pie in the sky. I wish we can somehow take the politics out of this, because I think you got extremes on both sides. But the bottom line is, the way I look at it, the cost of energy is going to skyrocket in this country. With some of the EPA regulations coming down, the cost of electricity. And when the cost of electricity goes up, disposable income goes down, and then people aren't able to travel to come to resorts like Virginia Beach. I remember back in the 70s waiting 3 hours to get a tank of gas back when. We are dependent on foreign oil, and to me that's a national security thing, and it's also a major economic driver for this country. But that being said, and even with the Keystone Pipeline, I think that was a political decision, not a practical one. We got to somehow, I wish I can pray, get the politics out of this. And the point is that we can at least have an honest discussion and talk about things, because if the price of, gallon of gas goes up again, you said it fluctuates. If it's $10 a gallon, like some of the proponents of a limit, raising the price of gas to cut down on consumption, it's going to hurt our tourism big time. So the point is, let's at least have an honest discussion and do a true cost-benefit analysis on this. And, let's be open-minded. Thank you.
Ben.
Thank you. And thank you for your presentation. And to Bobby's point, as far as, if gas were to go to $10, I think what they mentioned in the report was that the fractional amount of oil that they could pull out of the Atlantic wouldn't have any bearing on that actual market price. And then one more thing, in the event that there were an oil spill, that would really hurt tourism. And so, I think these are things that we do need to look at. This is an issue that I'm learning a lot more about, and that I still have a lot to learn about. I will say, just me personally, I am somewhat uncomfortable having the council sit here under the 2010 resolution supporting offshore drilling. I do think that it would be wise for us to maybe take more of a neutral position until the facts come out. I think that the council agreed after the last briefing to look at the numbers or the new report from the Department of Defense, and I would think that it would be a wise decision for us to remain neutral until that comes out.
Yeah, just a quick point, Mr. Davenport, and I respect your opinion, but the other thing is, I think we also have to learn about the new and emergent technologies that are coming up that would minimize the risk of a spill. Is there always going to be some risk there? Yes, but still we have to weigh it against the big picture.
Thank you. John?
Well, this is a very complicated topic, and anyone who goes into details and understands what's going on with current oil prices would know that the Saudis are out borrowing hundreds of billions of dollars to continue their expenditures while they sell gas at a lower price, trying to affect things. And so that's causing an atypical market suppression of prices. And anyone who studies long-term energy prices would understand that, and we look at the long-term trend lines. And I think that's the kind of, why I'm making this point is, that's the kind of integrity of analysis that this council needs, is to understand both sides of the equation. I'm not opposed to a neutral position at all, but to take a position and to either side and to say they got the claim, and in the return, rather than people being able to earn $40,000, $60,000, $80,000 a year, we're telling them that they should be happy to make $19,250, that's a hard sell to tell people that's a job creation market that they should tolerate. I just find that unacceptable. So I think there has to be a different model that we approach this from, because people are part of the environment, people are part of the future, and we have to make sure that we make room for everyone to be prosperous. And it isn't this dichotomous picture that we're getting, and that's what's difficult for me. It's this or this, and I refuse to accept that it's that dichotomous, and I think that's what's difficult for all my peers, I believe. Thank you very much.
Shannon?
I do think, John, we have to remember too that out of those 12,500 jobs making 19,000 average or whatnot, many of those are the high school kids and the part-time jobs that we're giving them those learning abilities and those learning opportunities rather. And we do have some higher salaries for those full-time jobs. And I'm not sure how many part-time jobs and high school kid jobs are going to be created with the offshore drilling.
That's true. There's also people on southeastern visas, cultural visas. But the average weekly wage in Virginia Beach is $740 a week for the private sector, people who work in Virginia Beach. Multiply that times 52, you don't get a very big number. And we have a lot larger number, you can look at the bond prospectus, making substantially less, $300 and something a week. So I do think it does hold to the tourism as a whole in any country. It's the nature of the business. It is lower wage paid by very definition.
I think we see that we're going to have a great discussion on this, and I applaud our council taking this on, and John just suggested going neutral, Ben did, and as my name is on that solely, that we approved some time ago, I certainly wouldn't object to that either, so.
Thank you, Mr. Fair. I'm willing to do it.
Huh? Yeah, and so, I mean, in the very near future, I'll pull that one that I brought out here and we supported and suggest, not that we're against it or for it, we're going to take a neutral position.
We're still listening and learning.
Right, am I hearing, see nods of heads here?
And there's still some old steps.
And I thank you so very much. Any other comments? We will adjourn.
Something